All right, welcome everybody to our October edition of our webinar series. I'm John LaFranco, Manager of Coaching Education for Athletics Canada. And we have a really special guest today with us, Steve Magness, who you may have heard. But first, breaking news, we just learned that Steve Magness is half Canadian. This is blowing our minds here. So this isn't even like we got international talent here. This is homegrown talent on our webinar today. So Steve Magness, world-renowned expert on performance, well-being, sustainable success. His most recent work is Do Hard Things, Why We Get Resilience Wrong and the Surprising Science of Real Toughness. He's a co-author of the best-selling Peak Performance and the Passion Paradox, and a track and field coach. So worked with some of the best distance runners in the world. So his all his books, his new stuff is sort of very general audience, but we're really excited today to be able to bring it back to track and field. So a couple things before we start. You are all muted. If you have questions, you can put them in the questions dialog box on your screen. Vous aussi la bienvenue de demander des questions en français, puisque Steve est Canadien évidemment par français. Non, c'est pas vrai. Steve, I just said that because you're Canadian, you speak French, so you'll answer questions in French. That's not true, but if people want to, si vous voulez demander des questions en français, je vais les traduire. I will translate questions in French. So Steve, we have some prepared questions. Steve and I are going to chat a bit, and then we'll get to your questions. We'll answer them. We're recording the webinar. It's going to be on our AC YouTube channel where all of our webinars are, and coaches who have entered their NCCP number will get one professional development point for participation here today. So Steve, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Man, I think you just broke the news. I don't think I've ever publicly told about my Canadian heritage. So my mom will be very pleased that I'm embracing it now. So thanks.
This is good. We always want to make mom happy. So let's start off with a question, big kind of more of like a big picture question. The title of the book is Do Hard Things. So what are hard things? What makes a thing hard?
Yeah, I guess I should know that since it's in the title. So here's what I would say is in athletics and track and field, this comes very easily, right? Is doing the challenging race. It's that moment or that workout where you have doubts, insecurities. You're like, I don't know if I can get through this. Well, in the rest of the rest of our life, I think hard things are similar. Anything that elicits kind of that anxiety, those doubts, that stress, that fear that I don't know if I can do that. Anything that elicits that is to me a hard thing. And we can look at these on a perspective of extreme challenges where, I might not be able to do that thing, or even what I'd call simple everyday hard things, which might be getting through an entire conversation without reaching for your phone. Like that is a hard thing now. So if we work on that, we're literally training toughness. So I think we can look at it in that experiencing discomfort kind of model.
That's great. Yeah, it's true. There's so many things, throughout the day that are just sort of hard, and we get through them. People are resilient. So you start your book with a kind of a counterexample, the traditional view of toughness. Bobby Knight, American college basketball coach of some repute, I guess. There's like a YouTube video of him throwing stuff, as which, any good coach can launch a chair, obviously. But, it's clear from the examples and that anecdote, like his behavior is bad. It's not, optimal coaching behavior. But my question to you is, his team still went undefeated. So how do we convince coaches like who kind of see that example and who have this old school kind of way ingrained that like actually no, there is a better way. You can still win by not, kind of yelling at people.
Yeah. So here, I think this really gets at success is complicated. So I'll give a track and field example. If you go back and you look at Jim Ryan's high school training, it's the craziest thing you've ever seen. It's like doing 5,400s one day, 2,800s the next day, a 15-mile run the next day. It's just all sorts of crazy stuff, intervals, high volume stuff. Now, Jim Ryan was the best high schooler, in the country, and then went on to be the world record holder. So he did really well. But I would argue that there are very few coaches alive who would look at that training and be like, yeah, this is what I'm going to do with my athletes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Success is complicated. So
Yeah.
when we look at a coach like Bobby Knight, we can say, okay, he was successful. But generally what that means is that he was doing something right, but not everything right. And if you talk to people who are basketball, coaches, experts, all that stuff, they'll tell you Bobby Knight was a genius of X's and O's. And that's what led him to get success. His throwing chairs probably got in the way, but because this was the 1970s and 80s, where, quite honestly, if you signed up to be on his Indiana Hoosiers team, like you had very little options. Like you were there. It isn't like 2022 where you could say, you know what, I'm going to go transfer and go to another school. Like it was very kind of, you were stuck. So in that regard, some of these old school methods worked simply because the players had very little autonomy and choice, and they had to stick it through. So you could kind of be an asshole and still keep your best players. Well, today, if you did that, you'd probably lose all of your team, and your player, you wouldn't go in defeated, you get fired.
There you go. No, that's good. Context matters. So my next question has context in it. So it feels intuitively though, like, hell weeks, and even just, we do training camps and like, Jim Ryan's training, whatever, like there must be some, physiological training performance benefit. Like we know, like, yes, you have to run hard to get better. And in your book, you kind of explain the context that is required to make athletes more self-aware and be able to get more out of these events, like the example of the Marines training, and not only be, kind of get out of it just like unscathed, but actually get strong. So how can coaches prepare athletes for like really hard training?
Yeah. So here I think is number one is setting the expectations. So if you're going to do some really hard training or some really hard workout, the best thing you can do is set them up so that they see it as a challenge instead of a threat. So you want them to see it as like, hey, this is going to be really difficult. I might not, run the splits exactly, get through it, whatever have you, but this is challenging me to get better. And when you do that, psychologically, what happens is our biology follows. So when we see things as a challenge, we tend to have a stress response that is more productive. So more kind of adrenaline and testosterone, versus threat response has more like cortisol, which tends to put us in a mindset of like, I'm just trying to survive and escape and get through this thing or get out of this thing. So that expectation is really important on not only what the difficulty is, but also what you're trying to get out of this. And I think this is the part that the military does really well is once they get through the crazy stuff, it's very, you talk to people who have gone through special forces and stuff, is when they do some of that crazy difficult training, it's very clear on what it's preparing them for. So they're not just suffering for suffering's sake. They're going through maybe a simulated torture session because they're saying, hey, just in case we're in war and you ever get captured, like you need to have the mental fortitude and skills to understand how to get through this. We're going to teach you those. And part of teaching you is to simulate that in a kind of really kind of scary way. And it's okay. You fail, like we're going to learn from it and we're going to like teach you how to do this better. So I think it's very similar in the sense of, workouts is give the purpose and reason and make sure it's not, hey, we're just going to suffer for suffering's sake.
And maybe tell the story about the Marines and make people realize like running is like not so bad actually. Right? Because like that's a real threat. Like they're preparing for a real threat. You're preparing for a good challenge when you're doing running training. You also write about something called learned helplessness, and this kind of struck me. I feel like in sport we've sort of created this in the traditional means of coaching, where like I don't know. I've talked to coaches sometimes, and like like I was like 50 minutes late for practice, and like and I just kind of showed up, and they were just waiting for me, and they didn't start the warm up, and they didn't know what to do. And so like by creating such a kind of rigid structure where like the coach has to be there to say the thing, that like there's sort of no kind of independence or whatever. It's this learned helplessness. So how do we untrain athletes in this who have been kind of brought up through that system?
Yeah, so that's a good point. And I think that's something that we do unintentionally is the way to untrain it is essentially flip that script and instead of training helplessness, train hopefulness, which means like give them choices and autonomy so that they can like grow. And often when you have someone who's sitting there and like, is the kid who just waits for the coach to tell them exactly what to do, you have to start in small bites. So start with the simplest thing on like giving that person a choice and some autonomy to make a decision. So it could be something as simple as like, hey, you get to decide like what drill in the warm up. I want you to add one drill in the warm up, like get it done. Or like whatever have you to add, something else. Or, as an example for coaches, one of the things I like to do is like start giving them a little bit of freedom on like, the last part of the workout. Like I'll be like, hey, we've got 1 rep left. Like, how fast do you want to run it? And you're giving back a little bit of that freedom where they realize like, oh, I'm not just trying to do exactly what the coach says, but I have some freedom to choose in this spot. And anytime we make a choice, we're essentially training that autonomy and that kind of learned hopefulness instead of helplessness.
That's great. Yeah, actually, if people want to go to our YouTube channel and check it out, there's another webinar we did with Alex Hutchinson, who wrote an article about some research that a couple Canadians are doing, Jim Dennison and Tim Conoval at Alberta, on this sort of very thing about, kind of giving the athletes more agency in what the workout's going to be. And we actually had the opportunity about, I don't know, like 10 Canadian coaches to do sort of a workshop with Tim and kind of work through this. And myself and my assistant coach did, and we got to, it was cool. We just gave us ideas for just doing some like different things and different workouts with the team. And I think that it's hard to measure, right? Like how much it changed anything, but I think it helped in that their expectations weren't, sort of, no, I don't think that we really have this environment anyways, but like they moved away from this kind of like the dreading the workout and more towards the like, okay, like what are we going to do today?
Yeah, no, I love Jim and Tim's work. I actually competed against Tim a lot in college. So we had some great battles. So he's been a good friend. But I think there's something to it. Again, not all the time, but every once in a while, kind of dipping in and saying, okay, like give our athletes some choice on like what they're doing. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. It's not just like, hey, make up the workout or what have you. Like, you can do this in how you structure workouts. I love doing this in fartleks and tempos, where I'll say, hey, the goal is to spend about 30 minutes at our kind of threshold pace, but you get to decide how you want to do it. If you want to go 30 minutes straight and you feel great, go for it. If you want to go, 10-10, 5-5, whatever it is, like great. Or if you just want to run until you feel like you're going over the threshold, then take a little break and then start again, and whatever that adds up to. Awesome. And what you realize is that by giving them a little bit of choice in that, it not only, I think, gives them agency, but I think what it also does is it makes them responsible. So for example, on that threshold example, then they are in charge for reading their body and being truthful to like, the instruction might be like, hey, once you feel like you're going over that threshold edge, stop, take a break. Like they have to read it. And then you as a coach have a coaching point afterwards where you can say like, hey man, like you executed that great. It looked like you stopped at the right time. Or you can say like, hey, I could tell that like the last couple minutes, like you were fading, like you were working too hard for this workout. Like, why did you do that? Why did you not just like call it at that point? And often you can uncover some maybe insecurity or inability to like listen to their body that then you can work on that will help them in races and future competition.
Yeah. And they're responsible. Like, it's not like you're going back to them and saying, why didn't you do what I told you to do? You're just sort of saying, well, okay, why did you do what you chose to do? Since it was your choice. So just explain to me what you did.
Exactly. It becomes a great kind of coaching dialogue that you can kind of create.
Yeah. So, okay, next question. So how long does it take to learn these skills? And I'm talking about, kind of in the second and third pillars, like
Yeah.
the sort of the creating separation, that stuff, like, is it a week? Is it a month? Like, is it like over a lifetime? Is it something like once you get it, you've got it, or do we have to like keep training it? Like, where does it fall? And like endurance takes a while to ramp up, and then you keep it, and like speed, you can kind of train it quickly, but you lose it quickly. Like, where can we slot this in?
Yeah. So here's the good note, or the bad news is no one has any idea. But the good news is this, is that some of these skills, for instance, you just mentioned like kind of creating that space and separation so you can decide. Well, if we look at one of the contributors to that, which is kind of like this ability to be alone in your mind and have like some mindfulness, we know that changes occur within a couple weeks of even doing like 4 or 5 minutes of mindfulness, a couple times a week. So that's not a very high dose, right? That's going for a walk and being alone in your head for 5 minutes. That's not a big task, right? That can create changes in your kind of mental skill set. So we know that it doesn't take a crazy amount to start developing skills. And then on the flip side, what we do know is that once you've developed some of these skills, they're not fully there, but they never fully go away. And this is what we know this partly from research, but also because of experience of old guys, because they tend to have what we call like old man strength, where they're not as fit as maybe they could be, but they're still able to get a lot out of themselves. And one of the reasons that occurs is because they have this toolkit built up over the lifetime. Now,
Sure.
the one
I used
thing,
to be like that, but now I'm just not fit enough at all.
yeah, but that's the other caveat. If you let it all go away, for instance, I remember maybe a couple of years ago, I tore my Achilles, and then I was coming back, and the first workout back, I was like, okay, yeah, I'm finally healthy. Let's go.
Yeah.
And I'm doing like a tempo run, which wasn't that hard. And within the first sign of pain, my mind is screaming at me to stop. Why? Because I hadn't felt that for like, at that point, like years.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a skill that kind of fades, but the good thing is if you've trained it, it comes back quickly.
It's good. So coaches like workouts, is there any like track workout, running workouts that you have kind of designed or whatever that sort of train these skills? I mean, you mentioned like doing mindfulness training, but like something that, running wise.
Yeah. So one of the things that I love to do is do workouts that increase or create some sort of uncertainty or stress around it. So one of my favorite workouts to do is essentially going rep by rep. So we had this great grass field, couple soccer fields, had 3 essential loops that were, I think, like 1,000 meters, 600 meters, and 300 meters around various fields. And what we would do is just go rep by rep. I'd just stand in front of the team and be like, okay, this one we're doing 1,000 meters at whatever, 310 per K, whatever it is. And then they go run that K, they come back, and then you're like, okay, next is this and this. And what those kind of workouts do where you don't give full information is it forces athletes to wrestle with uncertainty. Because in normal workouts, if I say, hey, we're doing 10 400s and 62 with a minute rest, they can cope with that because they know, okay, like on number 5, if I'm not feeling great, I might have to slow down by a second so that I make sure I get through 6, 7, so that once I get to 8, 9, and 10, I know I got it because I'm almost there. When you take away that information, you can't cope with that. So it forces you to stay in the moment and focus on the task at hand versus worrying about what's coming next, et cetera, et cetera. So I love using, just simple tools like that, where you're just changing things. Other ones that are a little more cruel are adding stuff to workouts. So one of my favorite things to do, again, this is really cruel, so I don't use it very often, is when someone's completed the workout, they have that kind of relief afterwards. And then like a minute later, I'm like, okay, back on the line, we're going to do another 400.
I'm laughing because I know athletes I coach are watching, and I did that to them like a couple weeks ago. And it wasn't short. It wasn't like 400. It was like a 2.5K.
There you go, man. You're even more cruel than I am.
They were like, why? And anyway.
But there's certain things like that where, again, it's the mental that you have to manage there, because in that moment, you've already released, you've already come down. And then they have to figure out how to get mentally back right in their head, and then realize that I thought I was tired and exhausted, but I still have more in the tank and still can go further.
Yeah, exactly. It's a confidence boost because you think you're done, and then you're told to do more, and then you do more, and you're like, oh, I can do more. So that's just, it's very it can be empowering by the end of it, even after they're done cursing you.
And there's all sorts of things, and I'd suggest that like coaches like be creative in this stuff. Some of my favorite workouts was back when I was training with Alan Webb and coached by Scott Rasko, and Rasko had this kind of streak where every once in a while on a workout, he would go kind of set by set, and then you could tell he'd get this look in his eyes. And that meant like that last set, he was going to throw something at us that was just like all out, just like see what you got left. And I'd watch like Alan run like, I don't know, a 50-second last 400 for rep number 15 or something crazy while I was dying running.
Claim to fame. I once got lapped by Alan Webb at the Penn Relays 5,000.
There you go. You go. So, but I love
it's that extra 50. That's why.
That's why. That's what it was.
Probably that.
But I love using, again, not all the time, but every once in a while, it's like get a little creative. And I've had other coaches who have, I'll do this with my marathoners. Actually, every once in a while, I'll be like, you know what, we got whatever 12 miles at marathon pace, and then mile 6 I'll be like, hey, we're gonna drop, like, they get to mile 6 and I'll be running or biking next to them and be like, drop the hammer this mile, like go 20 seconds a mile faster, put yourself in a hole, then back off. And then you have to deal with being in kind of a hole when you weren't expected to, and that has that kind of mental struggle. And also, you never know what athletes are doing, so that sometimes happens in races.
So races. So another thing you mentioned in your book, is the sort of the interior monologue and the zooming and the positive self-talk. So my favorite thing that coaches do is yell very loudly in a not at all relaxed way for athletes to relax. And I've done this myself, I admit, and then but I try not to do it anymore because it's silly. It doesn't make sense. How are you helping an athlete relax? So how can coaches kind of tap into this, the elements of self-talk that the athletes are doing, and like what should a coach say to athletes during the race that can support this kind of thing?
So two things is, if you're going to say something that is like relax or whatever, make sure it has some sort of action or meaning to that athlete. So instead of saying relax, a much better thing to do is say, hey, shake out your arms, or drop your shoulders, or something that has meaning to them that gets them to kind of relax, but it's not doing it in like, just yelling at them to relax in a very loud voice. The other thing, in addition to that, is you can use cues, but those cues have to have meaning. I remember at one NCAA cross country meet, it just so happened I was kind of following around the Colorado coach, Mark Wetmore. And I just listened to what he would tell his athletes because I figured he was smarter than I was. And, for one of the race early on, he was just telling every athlete, like, check your instruments. And I don't know what, check your instruments meant to them, but to me, it was like, oh, he's telling them, hey, take a moment, see where you're at, breathing, whatever it is, and just see kind of where you're at and be aware. That makes sense. So have something in there that gives your athletes something that is pertinent and meaningful. And then the other thing that I would say is, if you see that your athlete kind of has that glazed over look or that freaked out look where they're in trouble and they're spiraling, that's where I think your job as a coach is to think, for this athlete, what in the world can I say that can kind of dislodge them and get them out of their head? So for sometimes that might be, hey, stop worrying about the race. I want you to focus on getting to the next turn, right? You're giving them a direction. Or for some, I'll admit this, for a couple athletes, this is where I will very rarely drop the opportune like F-bomb at them. Why? Not because I'm yelling at them and hopefully others don't hear it, but I need something that shocks them out to make them be like, hey, wait a minute. Why in the world is coach like cussing at me? This is crazy. He never does that. And you can use, or other times I'll give them a focus point of like, getting them out of their kind of their kind of self-pity in those moments, where I'll be like, hey, your teammates ahead of you are all in the top 10. Like, we're doing great. So like, get out of this spot. We need you. Come on. So those things work well as well.
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting. I actually, in my last year of high school, that's exactly what someone said to me. They yelled at me like, Steve, not you, obviously, Steve was third. And in my head, I was like, Steve was third? Like, oh wow, I got to get on my horse here. Like, that's amazing. It was perfect. The perfect thing to say. And actually, so I wanted to see what you think about this, because just this weekend at a meet, I actually told the athletes to write down what they wanted me to say. And it was interesting. Like, it made them think about it. One athlete said, nothing, just don't talk to me. And she was like the best. She was fifth, like, at the race. Like, she had the best race of anybody. So I was like, so this means we don't talk anymore, right? And she was laughing. She's like, we're talking right now. I'm like, okay, but anyway. But it was good, because it gave them, like, I think they heard what they wanted to hear, because I had just been saying things to athletes at races, and I asked athletes for feedback, and one guy told me, he's like, when you told me like, oh, go get that next guy, he's like, it was really demoralizing, because I thought I was having the best race of my life, and here you are just asking me for like more and more and more. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess that wasn't a good thing to say. So I thought I should just ask them they want.
That's the best thing you cannot do, and that's where the yelling cuss words at someone came from, because I asked the team, and one guy was like, this is gonna sound weird, but like, I just need you to just yell and scream at me during the tough part of the cross country race. And I'm like, all right, I'm not gonna do that all the time, but like at our conference meet, I'll pull that out. And that's what you got to do. So I think talking to your athletes and asking what they like to hear and what is helpful, because some like feedback, right? Telling them where they are or splits, and some just like don't want that stuff at all.
No.
So give them stuff that is useful to them.
Yeah. Okay, switching gears a bit. Talk about this idea of good quitting. So what's good quitting in running? Because I don't really want to drop out of a race or whatever, but what's an example of good quitting?
I'll give myself an example. So when I was still competing as an athlete, I was coaching as well, but I entered a half marathon to see if I had the goods to qualify for the Olympic trials. So I set out to run, just like 106 or so, and see how it felt. And I didn't expect any competition because it was local race, but there turned out to be a really good guy, a guy who went on to run, I think, 2:12 in the marathon. And I got overly competitive when my goal was to run 106. And what happened is, about mile 10 or 11, we're battling it out, and my calf just starts to cramp a little bit. And because I'm racing, I'm just like, screw this, like, forget you, calf. And it started hurting more and more and more. And I just pushed through, and I ended up winning and running 106 and change, and being like, oh yeah, I can definitely hit the trials mark in the marathon. The problem was I tore my Achilles. That might be the extreme answer.
Yeah.
But the answer that I like to give is like, you gotta know why you're doing something, and like, be aware so you can check that comparison point. Now, in races, we might have a higher level, but think about that in workouts. So many injuries occur in workouts that are, you're aware of them. They're coming up. It's probably not worth finishing this last rep or whatever on this kind of meaningless workout.
Yeah.
But you just do it because you're like, I got to finish. So in those situations, that's where we need the self-awareness to say that, like, yeah, of course I want to finish this workout or do this hard thing or what have you. But the tough decision in that moment is to pull back and say, you know what, over the career, over the season, is this going to put me in the best position to be ready when I need to be? If it's not, then like, quitting might be okay.
Yeah. The hard thing is to not do it, as opposed to doing it, which is, what it usually is. So, the stuff in the book seems really, like it could be really effective, not only running, but in all areas of life. And we're talking about running, we're talking about, kind of collegiate level runners, but is this something we could start athletes with earlier in their, athletic careers or just as young athletes, like at what age would you start this, and what's like maybe an adaptation for like, little kids or something? Because I think, and maybe you have a take on this, like I feel like little kids kind of already have this pretty well down, like most of them, if they're just doing a sport or playing a thing, like they're okay, and it's a little later that things start to shift.
Yeah, so there's two things on that. Often you see that because little kids are oblivious and they don't pick up on the expectations that are both external and internal until later. So because it's like, who cares if I don't win my soccer game? Like, I'm going to get over it and go play video games or whatever it is, right? So often that they kind of have some of these skills there. But I will counter and say that there are certain skills, for example, awareness of kind of like our internal sensations, feelings, emotions, all that stuff, where I think we can start to develop those in kids. And the example I'll give is my wife's an elementary school teacher, was also a very good runner, but she always talks to me about, why kids throw tantrums in like, first grade or kindergarten or whatever.
Yeah.
And the reason is pretty simple, is that they experience something kind of bad. Someone steals their pencil or like doesn't pick them at kickball, whatever it is. And then they say, oh, I feel sad or upset. And no matter what happens, 9 times out of 10, they'll say, I feel sad or upset. And the reason they keep using that words is their vocabulary for their inner turmoil is very limited. Yeah. So they can't slice and dice it apart like you and I might be able to say, like, I feel frustrated or jealous or lonely or whatever it is, descriptor you want to use.
It's like everything's spicy.
Yeah.
You see the Nick Kroll thing on Netflix? Everything's spicy. Because that's what my little son said. Everything bubbly water, spicy. Everything's spicy.
Exactly. It's like the simple everything is this. Yeah. So one of the things that we can do, I think, with kids is, again, keep it age appropriate and simple, but like teach them some of these like descriptors and like how to notice like what different kinds of soreness or fatigue or whatever have you, because like that skill is going to come into play, as they develop, whether that's in sport, but it also is tied heavily to having emotional control. Is the more you can kind of slice and dice the inner world apart, the more you can deal with it.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, another good way is for coaches to also exhibit emotional control. I was thinking last night at practice, we're running on a football field, and this football coach just railed at these, like, I guess they were like 10-year-olds for like 15 minutes. And everyone, I was just, coaching, so standing there. And after the workout, all the athletes were like, did you hear that, coach? Like, he just was going to town on these kids in French and in English. Like, he did the whole speech in French and then he did it again in English. And so it leads to my next question, which is like, there's a certain moment, I think, when kids move in through sport and they get into sort of more serious sport, but sport has a general culture of like mistrust. There's always like this accountability and checking in, and, and I think like team policies that sort of have this assumption that athletes are going to try to get away with stuff. And so it's kind of based on mistrust. And so how can coaches sort of avoid falling into this trap and actually, foster trust and build trust into their programs?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is one of the big things, and there's actually research behind this, both in sport and parenting, that those coaches or parents who try to create that atmosphere that all is often out of like mistrust, like, I don't trust you, so we're going to have extreme rules and disciplinarian and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. They actually create players and kids who misbehave more. And the reason for that is very simple, is that kids don't learn that when we don't feel secure and like we're trusted, all we learn how to do is get away and get around the rules or what have you. Yeah. So how do you create an environment that instills trust, I think was the question. And to that is pretty simple, is if you look at how humans create trust, it's not that we trust someone and then we show who we are and we're vulnerable. It's actually the opposite. It's trust is created when I do something or share something with you that is just a little bit vulnerable or personal or like, opening up to a degree, and then you reciprocate it. And what that does in our brain is our brain realizes like, oh, like we trust each other because like I shared something that I normally wouldn't or what have you. And the wonderful, brilliant part about this is you don't need to go divulge your life story to 10-year-olds or whatever have you. But what it is it's giving away a little bit of that autonomy and giving them a little bit of agency on like, hey, I'm going to trust you guys to whatever it is, pick up the cones, like do something. Like, I'm not going to, get on your back and make sure everything is done. I'm going to trust you guys. And what that does is it sends that message of like, oh, coach trusts us, so we should reciprocate. Is it always going to work? No, but because you're dealing with human beings, right? But the more you kind of send that message and give people opportunities, the more ingrained it is. And the other thing I would say on trust is we often think it's developed in like organized ways. But what research shows, especially when they looked at how they created like trust and belonging in the military, is it was in those in-between moments where people are just like, shooting the shit, talking between workouts or on the cool down or decompressing after a race or whatever have you, where people kind of let the guard down and the facade down and are just who they are, or in the
Popovich dinner.
Yeah, Popovich dinner. Like those are the things that work. So try in your program to create opportunities for that like actual genuine conversation to occur. And if you do that, good stuff's going to happen.
Yeah. So I have one more of sort of my planned questions. We have 3 questions from the audience so far, and people, if you're listening, you have questions, just put them in the Q&A. You got time to answer. So my last question is, in your acknowledgements, you mentioned the willingness of your athletes to be guinea pigs, and I think that first, it shows obviously they trust you to an extent, but it shows a lot of confidence as a coach to experiment with new coaching techniques. Because I mean, obviously you have to do something and change to grow, but coaches, I think, tend to be conservative, politically or whatever, but just conservative in terms of the way that we coach, and think of like, well, I've always done it this way and it's worked, so I don't want to get out of that. So how do we encourage coaches to sort of take that step?
Yeah, so here's how I think about this in 2 ways. Is first, always doing the same thing is going to lead to different results, because your goal as a coach is to fundamentally change the person you're working with. We do that physically in terms of we could look at, their muscles, red blood cells, all that stuff. We're changing it. And we do that psychologically. So to me, I have to challenge myself as a coach to say like, I don't know exactly what's going to work, but I need to challenge myself to come up with new and creative ideas. And what I would say there is give yourself some parameters. So if you love the program and the training that you do, great. Keep 95% of it. But maybe once every whatever training cycle, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever, try something different and new. And it can be something very simple, but challenge yourself. And also what I would say is challenge yourself in a way that you can actually learn from it. So before I would try something crazy, I'd be like, okay, what am I trying to get out of this workout or this thing? Okay, this is my goal. This is what I hope it does. I do the thing. And then I'd reflect and often ask athletes, like, what did you think of that? Like, how did that help or hinder you? Did you think that was useful or not? Did this make you feel more confident? Did this like give you the right adaptation? Sometimes like really follow up and see if it's something that you want to keep in your program or not.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. That's great. Like, I think that there's tons of different ways to do everything really. And it's worth it to try something different, and getting the feedback is so huge from the athletes, because they are the ones that's what we do it for. They're the ones doing the running and stuff. So okay, so we have a question from Carla Del Grande. Carla Del Grande is the past webinar panelist. Our last webinar was about coaching masters athletes, and Carla is a world record masters runner. And so she wants to know, can we really learn to be mentally tough and to overcome past patterns of thinking from our upbringing and experiences?
That's a great question. So we're all shaped by our upbringing and experiences, and they definitely set the pattern. So there's tons of research on this, actually some really fascinating stuff that shows that, for instance, kids who go through traumatic experiences or through extreme poverty have like a what I'll call a heightened sensitivity alarm in terms of like seeing threats, because like they went through some really tough times.
Mhm.
But the good news is this, is that, well, that might be your proclivity. There's
Mhm.
room for improvement. And we know this through some interesting brain research that shows that, well, we might have a proclivity to have this like heightened alarm. You can train to dampen it down a little bit and shift it and change it. And there's been some wonderful work in, especially in the mindfulness area, that shows that you can kind of alter brain activation a little bit. So there is hope. So what I always look for as a coach is I say like, well, where is this person's baseline in terms of like stress, anxiety, like what they kind of fear in terms of competition? And if I know that, say, okay, great. I'm just kind of trying to nudge this. I'm not trying to make everybody some like monk or whatever who's impervious to everything. I'm just trying to get them a little bit better from where they are and keep their strengths while we're doing it.
Thanks. That's great. Great answer. Next question comes from Graham Wells. And the book quotes a person, Marcel, who states, pedigree gets you in the door. Thoughtfulness and self-awareness are what separate you. Can you expand on that? I think Marcel is Canadian too, isn't he?
Yes,
Yeah.
Marcel is a good friend. We went to college together. He was my Canadian teammate who would have me over for Canadian Thanksgiving while I was in college. So, okay, can you repeat that quote? Because now I got distracted.
Yeah. Pedigree gets you in the door. Thoughtfulness and self-awareness are what separate you.
Yeah. So what Marcel is now in investment banking, and what he was getting at there, and what the research actually backs up, is that yes, like your pedigree, where you went to college, your past success can often like open those doors, but they aren't the things that allow you to have success in those moments. Actually, I'll take it a slightly different way. Is I was fortunate in college to have a class with a former NFL general manager who won a Super Bowl as a team. And he always told me, he was like, after I won the Super Bowl, I thought, great, I made it. I've shown people how I know how to do this. Everyone's going to trust me. And he said, no, winning the Super Bowl buys you time, but you still have to do the work to show that like you have the awareness, the skills, the ability to handle different difficult problems in different ways. And that's what separates you once you get there. So I think so often we focus on the pedigree, but it's actually the skills that we need that are going to separate our performance over the long haul.
Makes sense. Okay, another question from Maddie Price. So as young people are entering different work cultures or environments that may still hold strong to the old view of toughness, how can we, the young people, help shape and move the organizations to the new model of toughness that you propose, especially as a non-authority figure?
Yeah, that's the really difficult part. The good news is this, is that while we're used to thinking that change comes from the top down, and a lot of it does, there's actually some interesting research in the workplace that shows that change can also come from the bottom up, because like there's more people on the bottom and their behavioral norms can kind of transcend upwards as well. So what I would say there is, look for small moments and small parts of how you're going to change the culture in the community that you're part of. So if you can't change the organization, then start with the things that you can change. In athletic sense, maybe just the teammates that you're with or you're a part of. And the workplace, maybe it's just the group that you're a part of, the managerial process that you're a part of. Start changing with simple behaviors there and setting those expectations. The other thing that I think is really important here is having conversations, but in a non-threatening way, with people who matter or who can make a difference. And the reason I say non-threatening way is going back to the old school coach. Like if they've had success in a certain way and you tell them this isn't going to work, they're going to look at you and be like, what does this young person know? Yeah. So instead, introduce small concepts in a way that is like, hey, have you guys thought about this? Or I was reading this article about X, Y, and Z, and try and tie it to something that they care about. And often that's a foot in the door for small changes of like viewpoints on this kind of like old school model.
Cool. Thank you for that. All right, we got some more questions here. I'm gonna tell you, a star-studded lineup of questioners. So Corey Belmore asks, Corey Belmore, is the world record holder in the beer mile. So because we get all the big names on this show. How do you get the most out of yourself in a race? Are there certain techniques that help you push more or closer to your limits?
Yeah, this is a great question, Corey. And you might know better than I because you're more successful. But here's what I can tell you is that they studied this in marathoners, so elite level marathoners, and they used to think like, oh, like there's a secret. And guess what? Disappointingly, there's not a secret. But what is the key though, and what they noticed is that the best marathoners tended to have more ways to cope than the next level down. So it wasn't that any one style to cope to get through, to get the most out of yourself worked best. It's that the best marathoners essentially had, let's say, a dozen ways to, talk to themselves, to deal with the emotion, to change what they're focused on, all that good stuff. And because they had so many strategies that they practiced and mastered, that if some failed, they were able to go on to the next one. So the advice is develop as many strategies to cope with the fatigue, pain, discomfort as you can. Try them out in practice and in racing. And sometimes, as my athletes kind of put it, they said sometimes you got to let yourself go to a bad place in a practice so that you can figure out how to work your way out of it in a new way. Sometimes make that the point so that you can develop a new skill so that when race time comes, like you got another tool in your toolkit.
That's great. So this next question comes from Scott McDonald, Michigan grad, if you know Scott. I'm trying to get athletes to approach mid-workout or race discomfort as a challenge, but they often default to watches and pacing. Classic story. Do you have ideas on how to get athletes to learn to feel effort rather than relying on technology? Taking watches away from time to time is an option, but for some it blows their circuits. It's a hard thing to take the watch off. Any other ideas on how to help athletes feel their way through discomfort? This is an amazing question. I think everybody wants to know this.
Yeah. So I'm actually a big fan of taking watches off, but I do it strategically because it will create freakouts. So for example, what I like to do is, let's say we're doing K repeats and we're doing, 8, is on number 5, I'll be like, give me your watch for this one. And I'll be like, I'll give it back, but I want just this one without a watch. And they'll still kind of freak out a little bit and some complaints. And I had one girl who literally stuffed her watch in her shorts and then pulled it out. So sometimes that stuff happens, but generally if you kind of constrain it, it allows them to be like, okay, this sucks, but I'm going to get it back.
Yeah.
And that takes away the freak out while still teaching the kind of moment. The other thing that I like to do is challenge them. So sometimes I'll be like, hey, I'm going to take the watch away and we're going to, I want you to run this mile in 5 minutes, and whoever gets closest, like, wins and gets to decide the next thing we do, or give them some sort of reward on that. And again, it kind of sucks, but you're forcing them to kind of be like, okay, let's figure out how to do this thing as well. So I'm a big fan of, again, it involves taking the watches away, but doing that. The other thing that I used to do in my younger, fitter days is show the importance of it. And this takes a little bit of knowledge of yourself, but I would say, I would tell the athletes, I'd be like, hey, I'm going to run a 400. Tell me what to run it in between, whatever's 60 and 75. And they'd be like 68. I'd throw the watch off and I'd go do it.
Yeah.
And that was, now I don't know if I could do that, but I could. And then I would use that as a lesson and be like, this is why it's important to run by feel.
Yeah.
Like if you don't, I can't. And then I'd also look for ways to kind of conceptualize it. For example, whenever we'd go to big cross country meets, I'd be like, you might have a watch, but that watch isn't helping you, the first 1,000 meters when everybody's going nuts.
Yeah.
So
in cross country anyway, like the terrain and the hills, like
exactly. It's not going to help you. So I try to tie it to something where they like, oh yeah, it's not. So
Yeah.
what do you have to do? You got to learn the skill.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's it. So like for people who are very, kind of nervous about it, like dosing it just a little bit at a time. And then otherwise it's like killing everything else, like give them the reason why, right? Say, okay, well, like we're going to do this, but this is why we're going to do it. And it's going to be okay. And it's actually going to help you. So, okay. Another big name question, Bruce Deacon, Olympic marathoner. A long time ago, you worked at a program that had an arrangement with the Navy SEALs whereby athletes did a mini hell week to develop athlete mental toughness. Did you experience this? What were your thoughts of this rather extreme approach to doing something a bit crazy hard?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I'll give this example. So actually we did this, the university I worked with did this once, and it actually backfired completely because we had a young freshman who got hurt doing this stuff and missed part of her cross country season. So I was very, very kind of pissed off.
Yeah.
But here's what I would say is those programs, will well-intentioned, often don't have the connection to the thing that we're doing, right? A runner already knows that suffering is part of it, and they will suffer in their domain because they know it has meaning and purpose. I can get them to do things, crazy things outside of their domain. Like let's say, hold their breath underwater or sit in an ice bath. But that only works if you connect it back to what they're doing. So saying we are sitting in this ice bath because I want you to be able to relax under extreme discomfort, which is going to help you when you tighten up in a race, because you tighten up whenever you get stressed. So we're learning how to do that. So that's why I'm not a big fan of doing like Hell Week type things, especially in running, because our sport already is really freaking difficult. I'd rather do it in a domain that relates to them where I can tie a lesson to it.
The football team should come to cross country camp and see how that goes.
Exactly. I've been pushing that for years, but no one listens to me.
They don't want it. They don't want to do it. Okay, question from Justin. Justin, who's actually a coach in my program, coaches with also Dawson College in Montreal. So given some of the research about the makeup of Gen Z, i.e. low resiliency, low self-efficacy, and especially low desire for independence, is there a different approach you take to coaching athletes of this generation? For example, do they need to be eased into claiming autonomy more than athletes of older generations?
Yeah, so generational differences are important. I think sometimes we overblow them, but sometimes there's some reality behind it. And here I would say is what I try to do is I look at what the generation kind of doesn't get and try and fill that need and like do so in a very kind of small dose way. So for example, with Gen Z, like one of the things they're not used to is having like real kind of conversations with peers and adults. So I remember what we did in the last part of my college coaching is I started having these kind of weekly small group meetings where we'd meet for 30 minutes and just talk about a topic. And we started off with all running stuff because I could get them to talk about running. But once they got comfortable talking, like by week 5, I was like, you know what, let's talk about some difficult stuff. So I'd slowly introduce the difficult stuff so that by the end of the semester, we were talking about, we were in America. So the hot topic was like, guns in school and why kids were dying. So they wanted to talk about it. So we talked about it and had an honest conversation. It was great, but it was like difficult stuff. So I think to me with the generations is like, look at their weak points, right? And they probably have low resiliency because, if you've read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, it kind of points to some of the reasons why. Well, give them some of the skills that they need and develop them. And then the other thing that I think is really important is often some of the generations are like the younger kids are like they are because they've never had a place where some adult like trusted them and wanted to hear what they thought and wanted to hear their opinions and wanted to like, and didn't think they were trying to get out of doing something difficult and just said, let's try this thing. So like support them and create that environment where maybe they have some freedom to to kind of express themselves in a way that, unfortunately society has kind of, kept at bay.
Yeah. All right. Okay, we've time for a couple more questions here. Okay, let's ask this question. Doesn't say who it's from. Oh, maybe it's one of my previous questions. Coaches today, I think, are quite aware of concerns about saying or doing the wrong thing. So like a kind of like a safe sport type thing. Even in well-meaning coaches, or especially with well-meaning coaches, there's certain anxiety about like can a coach have kind of like an okay style, but then you just kind of like mess it up with like one kind of incident, like maybe not like lose your job, but like lose the trust of your group kind of thing. And if so, how do you get it back?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's why, I'll be honest, the environment is really tough to coach in oftentimes, even if you're doing everything right. Because you do have someone kind of that fears, and those fears put you in a kind of apprehensive state where you don't open up, you avoid things. And what I would say is, can one thing, ruin everything? I don't think so. If you've created the right environment where the athletes know that like you have their best interest as people at heart. And if you do say something that goes in the wrong direction, and I've been there before, because like, I mean, once you get older, you start saying stuff where it's like, okay, for your generation, and you realize, oh crap, like this might not go over in the same way that for the younger kids or what have you. In what I would recommend there is own it, validate it, and like express like why it occurred, and then like move on from it.
Yeah.
And I think that is important, because if we ignore it, it festers. If we avoid it, it festers. If we like blow it up into something that is like this giant thing, the end of the world, that you are the worst person, then it kind of validates that they shouldn't trust you. So don't overblow it, just attack or address it as it is and be honest about that. And often that kind of vulnerability can create, can actually increase trust over the long haul.
Okay. Okay, maybe one or two questions. So here's a question. And hopefully you get the reference like in your book. So there's I'll read the question. So what is the line between athletes who seem to do better in the traditional VO2 max test versus the faster athletes who did better when they had more control? Like what I mean is like, what is there like a, like athletes who are running like a certain speed, like per mile were better? And are they fast because they can control it, or is it because they want it, that's their personality? Or is it just that as you get faster, you kind of get more control, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So this is based on a quick and dirty study we did that found that people attained higher VO2 maxes when they had some sort of a choice, so that they weren't just told like, hey, stay on the treadmill until you die. We gave them the choice to speed up, to slow down, whatever have you. And what we found is that the faster athletes tended to do better when they had the choice. Now, I can't tell you exactly why that is, because we didn't study it fully. But what I do know is, in the dialogue after, in the debrief after the experiment, is that athletes felt like when they were in control, it was more freeing. And they were like, I'm trying to see how good I am, how far I can push. When they felt like they weren't in control, when they were just trying to hang on, they said it felt more like survival. I was just trying to survive on the treadmill as long as possible. And when we know that when we have kind of approach orientated girls, we tend to perform better. As far as the speed, I think that's impossible to tell. But what I will say in our small sample side is it wasn't speed necessarily. It was kind of the level of the athlete. So in this case, if they were an athlete who was like maybe an athlete who had the capability in the NCAA to be all region or better, they tended to perform better on the self. If they tended to be an athlete who was like kind of a walk-on, who was just trying to make the team and wasn't a stud in high school, they tended to perform better, or equal in both. And I think the reason why in that was the less information kind of made it easier for them to grasp things. They didn't want the control because they were just like, either way, I'm just kind of pushing until I'm tired. And like, it's okay if I don't have choice because I'm going to freak out on whether I should speed up or slow down or what have you.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. It's 8 o'clock. We're going to do this last question from an anonymous person who wants to know, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to 401 high school miler Steve Magness?
Oh man, the anonymous question, the deep question. The advice I give to myself back then is chill out, because like I was the person who was like obsessed and like so single-mindedly focused, which helped my performance, but I also think it hurt because like it made running the only thing. So it was like do or die in races, especially as I got better and better and more notoriety. So to me, like if I could teach myself anything, and probably 18-year-old Steve wouldn't listen, so it'd probably be worthless, but I tell him like, hey, kind of chill out. And this actually gives, years ago, I was talking to a sports psychologist who was working with one of the best, athletes or middle distance runners in the US years ago. And he said, the only advice that actually helped them, I told them to get a hobby and then they perform better. Why? Because like the hobby took their mind off of only being focused on running, and that freed them up to perform to their capabilities.
Yeah, for sure. I've said this to athletes before, like thinking about the workout all day is not going to make you run faster in the workout. So, all right, that is all the time we have. Steve, thanks so much. Your answers were so great and generous, and people can. I'm just gonna pull this up here. I don't know how it's gonna work on the. You can't. Oh, there it is. Pick up the book. If you haven't already. Yeah, thanks so much. And Kyle, you want to throw up the throws summit? Do you have time for that? Our next online event is there's a National Throws Summit. So for throwers, or anybody else who wants to know about throwing things, it's going to be online on November 5th out of Athletics Ontario, and then in person in BC, Richmond, BC. And you can see the speaker lineup there. Richard Parkinson, coach of number 2 in the world, Sarah Minton, Mohammed Satara, coach of Cameron Rogers herself is going to be there, Kara and Russell Winger. So yeah, pretty heavy lineup going up there. So if you can join us for that would be great. Yeah, that's it. Thanks again, Steve, and have a good night, everybody.